Thank you for having me again. It was a bit unexpected, Lauren, but I'm happy to, let me just see whether I can get rid of the pictures that I have of several of you. Yes, so, okay. It was a bit of a surprise when you asked me to fill in, but I'm happy to do so. And what I'm doing tonight is based, well, tonight it's in the Netherlands, it's, what is it now? 7:40 p.m. What I'm doing here is based on a talk that I gave about 2 years ago for a group of Adventist theologians teaching at our seminaries and universities here in Europe. We get together every 2 years, and even though technically I do not belong to that august group, the Trans-European Division is always so kind as to invite me. And I talked about this topic, and so when Lauren, you asked me whether I could take a presentation this week, I went to that and put that into the form of a PowerPoint, and I hope that it is suitable for this audience and that we'll have a good conversation, a good discussion afterwards. So, the title is Loyalty and Responsible Dissent. And that word responsible is there with a purpose, because as we will see, I believe that dissent is something that is all right. It's even not only useful, but important to have, as long as it is responsible dissent. The things that we will refer to as the basic points, we're talking about authority, but also about the freedom of conscience, and then, of course, loyalty, dissent, and in the end, what is all important, integrity. So those are kind of the things that are in the background. Authority, it's important to note that that is not the same as power. Being in authority is not being the boss. At least it is not totally synonymous. The word has Latin roots, auctor, auctoritas. And when you go to dictionaries, you find that the root meaning is invention, advice, influence, command. As time went on in the Middle Ages, this word acquired the meaning of the right to rule or to command. So the power to enforce obedience. So the element of power is becoming more prominent. We find this word auctor in the Bible, that is to say, in the Latin translation of the New Testament, Hebrews 12, verse 2, where Christ is described as the author of our faith in the King James and the New International Version, and the Vulgate, the Latin translation, the Old Latin translation has auctor fidei, well, maybe the best word is initiator of our faith. And the word there does not emphasize authoritarian power, and neither does the Greek word archekon, which is more pioneer, precursor, initiated. Related Greek words in the New Testament are dunamis, exousia, often translated by the word power, but the root meaning of these words do not convey authoritarian power, coercion, or force. So when we talk about authority, I think that is important to keep in mind that it's not just the very same as having power. Authority is needed. We need authority in society, in organizations. There needs to be a certain structure where the relationship between the various stakeholders, that's a modern word that we use these days very much, the various stakeholders must be defined. And often we find that the structure is hierarchical, that there are degrees of authority, that some have more authority than others. But some kind of system, some kind of structure is needed. When we want to make rules we need to have rules for decision making. There needs to be a clear division of responsibility in any kind of organization. And there are ethical and moral dimensions to many of the issues we are dealing with, regardless what organization. And there needs to be some ethical and moral authority in order to keep things on the right track. In the church, we also need authority. It does, however, differ from secular authority. After all, the church is Christ's church, and he, Jesus Christ, is the source of all authority. He is the head of the church. All human authority in the church, if there is such a thing, is delegated authority. It is not original in ourselves, but we have been delegated certain tasks, certain responsibilities. It is delegated from him who is the head of the church. And the kind of authority must always be rooted in what Scripture tells us in divine revelation, where the basic issue is the priesthood of all believers. Beneath everything else, there is that fundamental premise that we are all equal in status. We may have different roles for Christ. All of us are. What is happening here? Okay. In Christ, we all have the same status. I'm quoting from a Catholic scholar, John Mackenzie, who said it is clear beyond dispute that Jesus established something entirely new in the authority which he conferred on the church. Authority as a function of love and as an operation of the Spirit has no precedent in societies which existed in Old Testament times or in the Hellenistic world, nor does it appear in social ethics of ancient and modern times. So this is a very fundamental, important statement that authority in the church means something different than authority in a secular setting. It is a function of love, at least it should be, an operation of the Spirit. And that was something new that did not exist in Old Testament times, nor did it exist in the Hellenistic world, New Testament times. The same author said, we always face the danger that the structure of the church will take on forms of secular society, and that the church will employ means proper to secular society. And I think when we look around us at church in general, and also in our own society, in our own church, then we see that there is that danger, and that often the church has succumbed to that danger. And Mackenzie says, when the church becomes a power structure, unless that power be the power of love, it takes on a secular character. And maybe we can keep that in mind as we discuss things later on. unless it is a power of love, something will go wrong. The authority, another quote here, by which the Christian leader leads is not power, but love. Not force, but example. Not coercion, but reasoned persuasion. Leaders have power, but power is safe only in the hands of those who humble themselves to serve. Now, I think all of us who have been in leadership positions know that this is quite a challenge. But it is true that the kind of power that Christian leaders have should not be the kind of power that is expressed in force, but it's example. It is not coercion, but reasoned persuasion. And it's only safe in the hands of those who humble themselves to serve. To serve, because the nature of church authority is best expressed in the term servanthood. Already Moses in Deuteronomy 17, verse 20, he told his people that the leader, the king, must not consider himself better than his brothers. It's not one higher, better than the other, but it's serving the other. As Christ said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And I am among you as one who serves. And it's significant that one of the last things that Jesus did before he died was to perform the rite of foot washing, to be the servant in a very tangible form. The term servanthood has become very well known in leadership theory, especially after Robert Greenleaf published his book about the theory of servant leadership. In 1977, the title was Servant Leadership, A Journey into the Nature of Legitimate Power and Greatness. Now, it has been criticized in many ways, this book, and it's already 50 years almost old, but still the basic idea continues to be valid, that true Christian leadership is servant leadership. And if you want to read a powerful story about servant leadership, it's Hermann Hesse's novel, The Journey to the East. Group of people getting into trouble as they travel. But then there is the servant, Leo, who is actually the real leader, and he gets them through. And that is a prime example, a very good example of how a servant becomes the leader by his attitude of service. So the nature of church authority is servanthood. And let me mention in this context that we are not very careful sometimes in our nomenclature, the way we refer to Christian leaders. You have in many church, in many denominations, you will see that the pastor or the theologians are expressed by the term reverend, or even very reverend, or your eminence, or whatever. In Dutch, we have the term dominee. So we never used to use that term in our church because we felt that was something that the other churches that belonged to Babylon, they were using this term, domine. It is from the Latin dominus, Lord. So it's the one really who has the authority, who is the boss. Nowadays, we find that this term that is used quite dominantly in other churches is now also used quite a bit in Adventist circles. And even this morning, when I was preaching in a small church somewhere, I was introduced as Dominee Bruinsma. So, but it shows that maybe we've lost something of the notion of servanthood. Church office, officers, are these words maybe also suggestive of some kind of superior status when you are an officer? You know, in most of our institutions, most of our various entities, conferences, unions, divisions, etc., you have people who work there, but then you have a very special group. They are the officers. And would that suggest that maybe they are not quite as much servant-oriented as the others, that they are more the bosses who really tell others what to do? How about the word senior pastor or lead pastor? Does that suggest a kind of hierarchy? And is that something that we should have? We find that in some of our organizations, also in conferences now, rather than speaking about treasurers, we speak of the chief financial officer. And we use other acronyms and titles that suggest that some people have more power, have more authority than others. And that is something which maybe we should watch, because it may express something of what is really happening. The characteristic word for church activities is the word diaconia, which is service. But that is just something that I am putting here in between. When we come to authority in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it's not difficult to mention some issues that are important. We have a hierarchical structure in the church, whether we like it or not, or whether we accept that this is a reality. And more authority in the church is exercised top down rather than bottom up. We may say that really it's the local church that's the most important. And of course, they tell the higher levels what to do because there is a representative structure. But in reality, we may ask whether that is the case. There has, and even Ellen White mentioned that, always been a tendency for some to assume more power than maybe has been delegated to them. Ellen White referred to that as kingly power. Even in her days, there were certain individuals who were really putting their stamp on the way the church operated. We may have question marks about the extent to which our Seventh-day Adventist Church is policy-driven. Now, many of you may not have seen the policy book. It's the so-called Black Book. And lots of the discussion at year-end meetings at various levels in the church has to do with refining policy. And the policy book used to be a modest publication of a couple of 100 pages, but it's way over 1,000 pages these days, because we find all the time that certain holes need to be plugged and that we need to have certain extra policies to safeguard some things, etc., etc. When we talk about authority in the church, we are also talking in particular about doctrinal authority. And we now have 28 fundamental beliefs. That's an authoritative document. We are all supposed to adhere to the 28 fundamental beliefs. And we have various groups of people in the church that are supposed to make sure that we stay on the narrow path. There is the role of the Biblical Research Institute at a general conference. It's there as a kind of watchdog. And it's interesting to see that when it comes to formulating doctrine, refining doctrine, more and more, it's the administrators of the church rather than the theologians that have a leading role. And that is something that I think is very worrisome. The whole issue of authority in the church has become somewhat overshadowed in recent years by what has been called the compliance discussion. As some entities in the church did not abide by some of the policies that were voted by the General Conference, the leaders of the church felt that something needed to be done to bring those entities into line, and a system of compliance committees was set up. They have not been very active so far. It has not been a great success, these compliance committees, but it shows there's some kind of power play, really, in order to make sure that the various entities of the church stay in line with what the top leadership has determined. Unity is unfortunately too often understood in terms of uniformity. And of course, if you want uniformity, then you need to have some system to enforce that uniformity, especially when you're dealing with a global organization with so many different cultures and so many different ethnicities. If you want unity in terms of uniformity, then you really need compliance commissions, and you need other ways to enforce that kind of unity. We have no time now to talk about historical development of our organizational structure. Just a few short remarks. We have gone through a very strange kind of development. We started out as a church with an aversion against too much authority, too much structure. And many of our pioneers believed that we should not be organized at all, because the moment they said we start to organize, we become like other churches, we become part of Babylon. But we did become organized, and we are probably now one of the most organized religious entities in the world. There has in our church been a strong influence of the American political system. And for me, coming from Europe, that has always been something that has worried me. I have been a president of a union, and I've had other roles in the church, but never with the kind of authority that a president seems to have in the United States, or the president of the General Conference seems to have. But that is very similar to the presidential system in American politics, where the president, he formulates a lot of the main emphases where the church wants to go, where the country wants to go, and selects people around him that will support that particular program. Anyway, when we talk about structure, administrative structure, organizational structure, it has the connotation of rigidity. And that is often what it is in actual practice. And certainly the 1,000+ pages of policies do emphasize that element of rigidity. And some leadership experts have suggested that rather than using the word structure, it might be better to use the metaphor of a web. So things are somehow in some kind of, well, structure, but it has more flexibility, more pliability, and more vulnerability. And this particular Baptist scholar says the web is characterized by stickiness, which holds those who move and dwell upon it. So, well, whatever, but I find that a rather more attractive metaphor than the word structure. Let me, at this point, mention one sticky issue that comes up all the time, in particular also in the discussion about women's ordination. And that is the idea that the General Conference in session is the highest authority of God on earth. And that is something that is that argument is being used, or maybe we should say abused, in order to push through particular views. Ellen White wrote in 1909, when in a general conference, the judgment of the brethren assembled from all parts of the field is exercised, private independence and private judgment must not be stubbornly maintained, but surrendered. Never should a laborer regard as a virtue the persistent maintenance of his position of independence, contrary to the decision of the general body. That is pretty clear. The General Conference is the body that has the final say, and we must submit to the final say of that general body. Robert Pearson, who was the General Conference president from 1966 to 1979, he admonished the staff of the General Conference, and I found that in a ministry article that was published around that in the late 70s. He admonished his staff that they should remember that we, that is the people working at the GC, are daily, hourly, momentarily a part of a group of leaders that constitute the highest authority of God on earth. So he did not only talk about the General Conference in session, but actually those people working in the General Conference building, they are daily, hourly, momentarily. So whenever they are working, they are part of a group of leaders that constitute the highest authority of God on earth. That is quite a thing to say. But we have another statement by Ellen White, 1875, where she said the GC is the highest authority that God has on earth. But when you look at the context of that statement, it was addressed to an employee who had refused to accept a particular church job. And so that kind of gives it a different flavor. And I think if we try to assess the weight of this statement, we must not forget that repeatedly Ellen White strongly expressed her doubts about the ways in which the General Conference leadership at certain times was leading the church. She wrote in her diary in 1894 that the leadership of the General Conference has become a strange voice and that God does not speak through them. So when we are quoting Ellen White, as in so many cases, you can get different points of view that do not totally cover each other. In 1877, the General Conference, during its session, passed the following resolution. And it's strange that this is seldom quoted by those who say that a GC session is the highest authority of God on earth. But there, 1877, it was resolved that the highest authority under God among Seventh-day Adventists is found in the will of the body of that people, as expressed in the General Conference when acting in its proper jurisdiction, and that such decisions should be submitted to by all without exception, unless they can be shown to conflict with the Word of God and the rights of the individual conscience. Now, here's something that I can live with a little better than with some of the just absolute statements about the authority of the General Conference in session. It should be obeyed when acting in its proper jurisdiction. And we should obey unless we feel that it conflicts with the Word of God or the rights of our individual conscience. So these are just a few things about this issue of the General Conference in session being the highest authority of God on earth. But let me go from this about the authority more in general to the authority of a group of people in the church that is of vital interest to the running of the church. We have about in the church worldwide 30,000 pastors, ministerial workers. And especially in the Western world, of course, their authority faces many challenges. They are given a certain amount of authority by the conference, but more and more their real authority must be earned by how they work and how they perform their calling. It is partly also based on their expertise, on their charisma. Authority has a number of different components. They are given their authority. That is underlined by giving them credentials. And a ministerial credential is valid worldwide. So if I put a ministerial credential, that means if I'm traveling in the United States, if I'm invited to speak, I can be allowed to speak because I have a ministerial credential. And I can be also voted into a particular office if a particular entity should want to do that. I was not a member of the church in Belgium. I was not a pastor holding credentials from the church in Belgium. But after I had been retired for a little while, they asked me to become their president for a little while. They could do that because of my credential. That credential was worldwide, and a conference president needs to have a ministerial credential wherever it comes from. Now, that's one of the differences for those who are commissioned. They can baptize, they can conduct the Lord's Supper, but it is not the worldwide nature that the ministerial credential has. The authority of the pastor is somewhat limited by the fact that there is a relationship to the conference. Now, when you look at the minister's manual and you go to some of the older versions of the minister's manual, it was very clear that it was actually expressed literally that the conference president was the supervisor of all the pastors in his conference. Now, the wording is no longer there. It is much more carefully formulated, but still, the pastor is expected to abide by the policies of the conference and is expected also to promote the programs that the conference is promoting. There is a relationship of the pastor with the conference president in particular, and also with the local church, where the pastor is, as it were, the most important of the elders, if you want to put a hierarchical spin on it. And sometimes that works very well, relationship between the pastor and the local church board. But there are also many examples where it does not go as smooth as it should. And there it is not always defined as much in detail as maybe should be necessary. But when we look at pastors, there are all kinds of questions that we can ask, and I'm not able to answer all these questions at this moment in this presentation. But there is the question, and I've often discussed that with pastors and leaders: must the pastor always go by the book? Or is there a certain latitude in specific cases? Now, when a pastor is asked to marry somebody, or in baptizing something, giving somebody access to the pulpit, discipline, how much latitude does the pastor have? Does he have to go and find the passage in the church manual and in the policy book? Or does he have a certain amount of freedom to use his own judgment and sometimes make some exceptions to church policy? To what extent can he openly criticize church policies? Now, for instance, if the pastor is convinced that women should be ordained, can he say that without repercussions? Or does he have to be careful not to say that kind of thing? Well, maybe it depends on what conference he is in, what country he is in, but to what extent can a pastor have its own opinion on some of the policies and some of the programs? Then, of course, can he voice dissent with regard to particular doctrines? On eschatology, Ellen G. White, about a sanctuary, the investigative judgment, relationship to other churches. To what extent can the pastor have his own opinion that deviates from things said in the 28 fundamental beliefs, or as is currently understood to be the meaning of the 28? And then, of course, there is the fact, can a pastor deviate in certain lifestyle aspects? Could a pastor come out of the closet? Could a pastor cohabit without being married? Now, there are many other questions that we could ask. To what extent is the pastor limited, constricted in how he can or she can operate? And some of the same questions apply to church members. Do you as church members have complete freedom to think? Well, maybe yes, but then to express your thoughts, or if you do, would that make your role in your local church difficult? Do you have to be obedient to all the rules and regulations of the church? Or can you voice dissent and still be considered a loyal and good member of the church? When can you follow your own conscience? And when we come to the fundamental beliefs, are all these fundamental beliefs really fundamental? Can it be that when you have 28 fundamental beliefs, they're all equally fundamental? Or is there some kind of diversity that can be accepted? But if there is diversity, are there limits? What can you do? What can you say and still remain a member, a vital part of the Adventist community? Whatever we can say about all these things, it is important, I think, that we are part of a community. And belonging to a community, serving a community, brings certain responsibilities. I saw this quote. It's already an old statement, but Josiah Royce, in The Problem of Christianity, about 100 years ago, he defined a community as a group of people who are bound together by the memory of a shared past and the projection of common hopes for the future. I've seldom seen such a nice, neat, and convincing definition of what a community is. A group of people bound together by the memory of a shared past. We come from somewhere, and the projection of a common hope for the future. We want to go somewhere together. And continuing in a community, being part of a community, requires a reasonable degree of consensus regarding beliefs and practice. On the other hand, everything cannot always remain the same. And development, change, maybe is really needed from time to time. So part of the community, being part of the community, means listening, willingness to listen to the community. And I'm quoting here from Raoul Dederen. He was a very prominent teacher at Andrews University. He died a few years ago. Belgium of origin, retained his French accent throughout his life, but a great fellow. And he said, and he wrote a very interesting, good article for Ministry Magazine. He says, listening to the voice of the community is not a sign of sheepish, spineless neutralism. No, he says, it is rather a cast of mind that expresses itself in a succession of ways. So listening to the community, first of all, means the readiness to go beyond the privacy of one's own views and to open up to the persuasion of a broader vision. Not just be content with what you think yourself, but being open to what the community says. Next, it implies the willingness to reassess your own position in the light of the church's decisions. If the church goes a certain way, you ask yourself, okay, is that okay for me? Do I agree? What are the issues? Third, it means a considerable reluctance to conclude right off that the church's decision is erroneous. In other words, when you're part of a community, you want to listen to the voice of the community, and you want to give real attention to what the community says. You don't just straight right off determine that you know better. But there's another side to it. Michael Kinnaman, he writes, true authority can never be imposed. It only works when it is offered, chosen, and freely adopted. Personal moral development requires critical thinking and not merely following conventions and conformity to rules. There must be a balance. On the one hand, listening to the community, like Dederen says. On the other hand, and I firmly believe that Kinnaman is right, there is another side to it, that authority can never be imposed, that you just have to swallow and that's it. There is your own moral development, the need for critical thinking. And you cannot just follow rules and conventions without giving it any further thought, but believing it because the church says so. When morality is constrained by simply focusing on obedience to moral authorities, we risk not becoming free, choosing, responsible individuals. And I would submit that is sometimes what we are facing in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, where we are constrained by the demand to simply be obedient to the higher authorities. And that gives the risk that we are no longer free, choosing, responsible individuals. The reformer, Martin Luther, modeled proper conscientious dissent for us when he said that his conscience was captive to the word of God, and that it is neither safe nor salutary to go against conscience. So there must be a balance between these various aspects. And even Ellen White wrote that political and ecclesial authorities, church authorities, they sin against God when they compel people to go against their consciences. Now, this is a pretty firm statement, and I haven't seen many places where that has been quoted. So, Gilbert Meyander, I believe he is a Baptist, he said the authority of the church must be respected because the church is addressed by the Lord. But the believer is also addressed singly, individually. That is, each believer is addressed not only by the body of Christ, but also by the head of that body, the Lord himself. So what the church says is important, but ask yourself, is it the Lord who says that also to me? The church, he says, the same scholar, also has the obligation to listen to and to examine the view of the individual believer or the individual pastor. Even if found unacceptable in many respects, such an opinion may contain a part of the truth which can then be opened up in fuller and richer ways. So there must always be a two-way traffic. We must listen to what the church has to say to us, but the church must also listen to the different voices that maybe have a different opinion, but can help the church to see a fuller and a richer picture. Johannes van der Ven, famous, yeah, I think that's true to say, famous theologian, expert in ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. He wrote in his book, Ecclesiology in Context, the church is always in need of reformation. And this reformation, he says, will never take place without conflict. In fact, the reformation of the church depends on conflicts and their balanced treatment. Being without conflicts is often a sign of a low frequency and meager intensity of interactions between members in the church. Now, that's an interesting viewpoint. Of course, when you only have conflict, it becomes very, very awkward for the community. But if there is no conflict, he says that may not be a good sign. There must be discussion, dialogue, even a degree of conflict, because that shows that people care about things, and that can bring you to a better understanding of particular issues. So, and I'm looking at my watch, I see that the hour is almost gone, but let me come to some conclusions as a basis for our further discussion. There is a point when the tension between the official views of the church and those of the individual pastor, and I should say member, may rise to a point where the church must take measures to protect its identity and unity. In other words, not everything goes. And there may be a point when the church has to say, no, we cannot tolerate this. This we must take disciplinary measures or do something else. The church has the right to discipline ministers, members, when they manifest a persistent lack of loyalty and no longer support the essential Adventist beliefs. So I do not believe that everybody should subscribe to all the 28 fundamental beliefs in all detail. But it seems to me that you can only call yourself a Seventh-day Adventist if you support the essential Adventist beliefs. And of course, no one is forced to remain a member of the church. or continue to serve as a pastor. Church is a voluntary community. So if you feel that you cannot in good conscience continue to support the views and the actions of the church, there may come a point that you have no other option to leave. Now, I criticize the church at many points, but I have not felt that in my life, in my experience, I'm close to that point that I have no other option but to leave. I try to continue to serve the church as best as I can and hope to help in the dialogue that I feel is essential for the church to engage in. A community cannot exist without general consensus about its goals and its self-identity. There must be some consensus about where we want to go, what we want to be. But on the other hand, responsible dissent can have a healthy influence, and that does not necessarily threaten the future of the church. In fact, I agree with Professor van der Ven that it is vital for a healthy future of the church that there is dialogue, that there is responsible dissent. Dissent forces the community to reassess its self-understanding. It is therefore important, and I feel very strongly about that the community creates channels for the expression of dissent. Now, the church has not been very good in that. And to some extent, organizations like Spectrum and Adventist Today fill a vacuum where some of the responsible dissent can be expressed. But the church itself should do a better job in creating channels for dialogue, discussion, where various viewpoints can be heard and expressed. With all of this, a knowledge of history is important. When you look at history, you realize that sometimes the church has been wrong. And that means that also today, the church can be wrong in certain aspects. And those who were willing to voice dissent, they were often pioneers of renewal and reform. And years later, it was seen that they really performed a vital function in the well-being of the church. A final thought. Many issues could, over time, I believe, be solved or at least be diffused if we would allow individually and corporately that our thinking and our interaction together be characterized not so much by being proven right, but by being gracious. It's more a matter of being Christian than about being right, theoretically. It would make a great difference in the church if we would always operate from the basic assumption that whatever our differences of opinion, these differences should not make us into enemies. We must proceed on the assumption that we all love our Lord and we all love our church. Now, I agree with those who say that that is not always possible, maybe, at least it's very difficult, but that is something that I think is basic for any kind of attempt to mitigate the polarization in the church and to help sponsor a responsible dissent and a healthy kind of dialogue and discussion. The assumption that whatever opinions we have, we all love the Lord and we all care about the church that we are part of. So, Lauren, I think that is where I want to stop, and okay. I'll come back to you. Let me see whether I can split here. I'm back.
Very good. Very, very good. Reinder. You had me most of the way through. I got a little uncomfortable at the end. I confess to you, and I noticed some of the people on the chat were talking about this too. I'll start with a question. Richard and Lee both have their hands up too, but I'll start with a question here. You started with the assumption that Christ is the head of the church, and that's beautiful, and it's aspirational. I don't know quite. I've been in the church so long. I've seen so much, and you have too. Let's not pretend that we don't know how much rottenness there is in there, and authoritarianism and hurtfulness that has gone on. How do you get from Christ as the head of the church to the church as it is? Do you understand my question?
Yes.
I think Elder Wilson, for example, who in my view, everybody who knows him tells me that he is a well-intentioned and good man, and I have no reason to doubt that. But his use of authority is not something that I find conducive to the notion that Christ is the head of the church. It sounds, his way of doing things sounds a bit Vaticanish to me at times, and it bothers me a great deal. I don't know that I trust him to be at all times reflecting the will of Christ. And you can just take that right on down the line. So often, what does it mean to say Christ is the head of the church? When I'm in a general conference committee meeting, they stop a lot to pray. And I think the intention there is to say, we're seeking God's leadership. But the prayers never seem like prayers where anybody is listening. They seem like prayers that are sort of, I don't know, a rubber stamp. I call them punctuation prayers. We're done with one program, so let's have a prayer. Now we're going to start the next program, so let's start with another prayer. I think they would say we pray a lot in our meetings, so we're seeking Christ's guidance, but I've never seen anybody change their mind or have something new come up or say, oh, we prayed, I'm not going to present this program. I don't think God wants us to do, Christ wants to do this. Everything is pretty much set in stone while we're saying that Christ should be guiding us. I'm sorry, I'm sounding terribly cynical, Doctor, but I'm going to go ahead and lay that out there.
Yes, and to a large extent, I can only agree with you. But I don't think that we can ever give up the principle that whatever reality is, that Christ is the head of the church, if the church means anything. And yes, probably if the good lady Ellen White would be amongst us today, she would once again speak about kingly power, because that is certainly what we see. And our church has developed its structure in such a way, and I mentioned what I think the fatal American presidential system that we have adopted in our church. That has become a major challenge, and well, we know of even of instances where we have unashamedly said that we have a kind of hierarchical system comparable to the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And in actual fact, that is what we see. Now, I think some of the things that I said in the beginning, they would apply to some, maybe many of our leaders, that if power that is expressed in coercion whatever well-intentioned that may be, but without the not within the context of love, that is an abuse of power. And that is, unfortunately, what we often see happening at the moment in the church, that it's well-intentioned. I want to believe, and I want to believe that Wilson and others love their church, and that they want, but what they want for their church is a model that is based on uniformity.
Mhm.
And fighting for uniformity is, in my opinion, in particular based on a lack of knowledge of the past. Unity in New Testament times was not uniformity, far from it. In the early centuries, certainly the church was very pluriform, and it was not uniformity. When we look at our own church, and some people are eager to go back to the days of the pioneers when everything was going well, the church was very much pluriform. And there was not this anxiety to be the same in all aspects. That gradually grew. And I think people are not sufficiently aware of that model. It has never been part of the history of the church and the history of our church.
So you say the early church was simply more congregational. Small communities had their own group and authority.
Yes, but also when you look at the different regions of the world, you had the church in Egypt developed along very different lines from the church in Syria or the church in other parts. And then of course, as the church developed, and you had monasticism developing, and that had many, many different forms. And the church, and maybe that was a good thing, allowed for different communities to have their own rules and their own ideas. And there was not this frantic search for doing everything the same way all over the world.
Yeah, I just wish we could help. I could see the evidence. I believe you that Mark Finley and Ted Wilson are well-intentioned people. No question about that. I just wish I could understand in what respect and how they go about, church leaders go about, Richard, I'll mute you again, you're a little noisy there. Go about actually saying, I am channeling the head of the church. And I'm not seeing it, Reinder. Mm-hmm. And I don't know quite how I would recognize if I did see it. I don't think I'm seeing it when Mark gets up and gives an hour-long presentation saying how we should push all the gay people out of our church. I don't think I'm seeing Christ being expressed as the head of the church. I think I'm seeing what you're talking about. Let's all get in line and have only the people we like inside. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. Let me put Richard up. Richard,
let me just react to what you just said about.
Okay, all right.
The sermon by Mark Finley. I was actually in some ways encouraged by that sermon. If the leadership at the top knows nothing else to do but to let Mark Finley have an hour-long sermon on that topic with all the ancient arguments, that clearly shows to me that they are losing the battle.
Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, you guys, you got something to digest with that one. Richard, let me get you up here now and join the conversation. I'm sorry I had to mute you a couple times there. You're stirring your coffee too hard.
Well, no, I don't think that. There's a lot of background noise. My wife is enjoying some great Christian music in the background. Listen, Reinder, I really, really appreciated your presentation. And I've always enjoyed your gentle poking of the bear. I just think that's an attitude we don't hear maybe enough. My question essentially is this. You raised a fundamental and I guess no pun intended question in your presentation when you used the term essential Adventist beliefs. And we have 28 passed by General Conference in session. And my question is, are they all essential? And if so, who decides? And so I guess my bottom line is, how do you define essential Adventist beliefs?
I wish you had easier questions. But I don't think, 28 different points can all be equally fundamental.
Agreed.
But my experience is that if you ask the average church member in the pew, give me the essential beliefs, what makes Adventism, they have 7 or 8 points that they will mention. And there are other points they will never mention or hardly mention. There is, yes, we believe in God and Christ, and we believe in salvation through him. We believe in the Sabbath. We believe in the second coming. We believe in conditional immortality. And there are 1 or 2 other things, and that is what they consider to be essential Adventism. That apparently in their experience is what it means to be a Seventh-day Adventist. So I would look in that direction, not the systematic theologian so much, but what in the experience of the church appears to be essential for most of the people. And I think there is definitely also a shift happening there. When many of us, and many of us are in our 60s, 70s, or more, when we were in our youth, there were all kinds of sermons on the investigative judgment, and there were sermons on aspects of the end time scenario. Many of these things, we don't hear them anymore. Yes, they are being pushed once in a while in a lesson quarterly, but they are no longer part of what people experience as, I would say, essential Seventh-day Adventism. And who determines that? It is basically, I determine what is essential Adventism for me, and you determine what is essential for you. And with the things that I consider essential, I feel that I'm a true and loyal Seventh-day Adventist, and not worrying about lots of the fundamental beliefs. I know they are there, but they have no real meaning in my everyday life.
All right. That was a very candid answer, and I would like to move on to Lee. You're up next, Lee. Join the conversation.
You're referring to me, Leland?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, Leland.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, 2 thoughts quickly came to mind as I listened to this presentation. The boundary, it seems to me, for loyalty to an institutional organization has to be on the theological integrity of that organization. I look at the example of Jesus Christ. If we ask the same question that was asked as the title of this presentation, how long would he have been, supposed to be loyal to the Sanhedrin. Luther, one of the great heroes of the Protestant movement. Here I stand, I can do no other, taking his stand on his theological understanding. It seems that that's the boundary for all of us, isn't it?
It is sometimes difficult, I think, to establish where the boundary exactly is. Is there a place, if you are one step to the left, you're no longer there. If you're one step to the right, you're still in. I think that, I know people who have clearly gone so far away from the essence of the Christian faith. Some who no longer believe that Christ is our Savior in any, real way, that I would say it's clear that they have overstepped the boundary. Now, some would say that you have overstepped the boundary if you no longer believe that that the Pope is the Antichrist. I would say that's a different kind of boundary. That if you do not believe that, well, okay, so you don't. What difference does it make in the end? There's no exact line, I think, where you can say you're out or you're in. But most of us have a sense, I think, of whether we have retained the essence of the Christian faith and the essence of what it is to be a Seventh-day Adventist. I often refer to something that was written in what's the name of? He recently died. Was a professor at La Sierra. Fritz Guy. In his book about thinking theologically, he gives a description of what for him it means to be a true and loyal Seventh-day Adventist, and that resonates with me. And I would suggest that people look at that and see whether they can agree with that, because he has formulated that much better than I have ever done. But it does not, at least for many other people, mean that unless you can say yes to all the details of the 28 fundamental beliefs, only then you are a true Seventh-day Adventist. And if you can do that, then, and that is actually what Wilson has sometimes said, you better leave. And I think that is a very deplorable statement to make.
See, I'm with you.
Yeah, may I ask one further question?
Yes.
Sure.
Well, Laura was here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that I can give you a couple of examples where the church as an institution has failed to remain true to the gospel. How much of that are we supposed to tolerate as loyal members? For example, during the period of time that I was in administration in the Adventist Church and attended the fall council meetings for the division, I found that the flow in Adventism is from the top down. The GC in the fall council would make a decision and give that to the divisions, expecting them to rubber stamp it. Giving the divisions would rubber stamp it, give it to the unions would rubber stamp it, give it to the conferences or missions would rubber stamp it, and that became church policy. I'll give you one example. While I was in church administration in the late 80s, a decision was made by the church that because of the converts that were occurring in Africa, some of whom, I don't know the number, were polygamist when they entered the church. And the church created a policy that said we must tell these people to get rid of all their wives but one. There in the meeting at the division headquarters, my hand goes up and I ask, where is such a policy founded in the Bible, either in the Old Testament or the New Testament? Obviously, anybody who's relatively well read in Scripture knows that it's not there. You can't demonstrate such a position. Mm-hmm. And yet that's one the church adopted, which very arbitrarily. The same thing is true of women's ordination. Nowhere in the New Testament has the church, well, let me phrase it this way. The church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to be precise, has never formulated a doctrine or a theological basis for ordination. You're talking about Christ being the head of the church. In the New Testament, that was applied, as I understand it, from my study of the New Testament, to each individual ecclesia, not only to the ecclesia generally, but each ecclesia Christ was to look to Christ as the head of the church. There is no centralized authority in the New Testament in Christianity for making that kind of a decision. It's absurd to require Finland to hold to some church policy that somebody in South America thinks is important, like the ordination of women. I have a young man that I know, his parents, his father served as a pastor. I'm sorry, I don't mean to do that. I apologize.
That's okay. So you're arguing for a little bit more regionalism, in other words, Lee.
Well, you mentioned a number of things, and they are examples of how politics and theology get mixed. And that is extremely unfortunate. They are at the same time also examples that show that responsible dissent is essential and must continue. And certainly the issue of polygamy, which you mentioned, that is quite a complex situation. And there was quite a bit of, well, there the African voices were not always as clear as they maybe should have been. Anyway, that is quite a different topic, but I think it shows that further dialogue and discussion and even dissent and expressing that dissent is important. And yes, I'm with you. I have attended many of these important meetings. I've been, I think, to the annual council of the GC about 15 times and been to 7 general conferences as delegate, or 6. And I know that the headship of Jesus Christ is an ideal that is often very far away, and that there has been a very unfortunate, and there still is today, a mix of politics and theology. And that is true nowadays, still with the women's ordination issue, and it's true for quite a few other things. Well, when you look at our history and you see about how the whole Desmond Ford case was handled, that's a clear example also of a mix of politics and theology.
Thank you for that good question and good answer. And I'm going to move on to Tamika Bonnick. Hey, Tamika, how are things in Roanoke?
Lauren, things are very cool in Roanoke today. I get to sit outside.
I noticed that.
Yes. Okay, so My question morphed as I listened to the dialogue that took place earlier. So I will begin by saying this. In my experience, before a baptismal service, candidates are asked to stand before the congregation, and they're asked to show their agreement to the fundamental beliefs before the baptismal service takes place. When I got baptized, we did not have 28 fundamental beliefs. Now we do. I do not think all 28 are essential. I do not agree with all 28. I will say that now openly. So I guess my question now is two parts. One, if I determine what is essential from those 28 fundamental beliefs, then when asked publicly to acknowledge, if I then decide I will refrain from acknowledging a few of those, one, can I be refused baptism? And I guess the second part of my question is, why do we still ask candidates to publicly acknowledge whether or not they agree with all 28 fundamental beliefs before a baptismal service?
Well, I was baptized when there were 22 fundamental beliefs. Are there any places in the United States? I guess from what you say, there are.
Well, no, I was baptized in Jamaica. I'm Jamaican.
Oh, okay.
So it's not a US experience for me.
Well, I would say that in most of what I'm aware of in the United States, and certainly in many of the Western European countries, there are just a few questions asked, but not the whole list.
Right.
And actually, in many countries where the whole list is asked, it is more a formality than anything else. Because, especially when you have these mass baptisms after a 3-week or 4-week campaign, most candidates have no idea what they're actually talking about, but they'll say yes because they want to be baptized. And that in itself, I think, is a problem, that in some parts of the world, we just accept people lock, stock, and barrel in great quantities without people actually knowing very much about what they say yes to. And then in other parts of the world, we are very critical of people who are just questioning some theological details of some of the 28. Should we ask people 28 fundamental beliefs before they're being baptized? Well, I think that'd be a good topic for a long discussion. You could argue that people are asked when they surrender to Jesus Christ. And there is then a period after that in which they are more grounded in the knowledge that a Christian must accumulate as she reads the Bible, etc. So in other words, no, if you don't believe in all 28 fundamental beliefs, if you are, if you feel you are a Seventh-day Adventist, and that you understand and live with what you would call essential, then we are brothers and sisters in the faith, because that's how I operate.
Yeah, thank you, Tamika. And hey, Carmen and I still hope to meet up with you and your husband down in Roanoke sometime. We love coming down there. Beautiful city, by the way. If you have not been to Roanoke, the Roanoke Hotel is, wow, really fun to stay in.
Okay.
I just want to say, Reinder, as I'm thinking of all of this, I'm feeling so out of place. you have it a few times made me feel like I should have quit. Like I don't really belong here, because I really played fast and loose with the rules. I mean, I took the attitude lots of times that it's better to get forgiveness than permission. I baptized people who just said they wanted to be baptized into Jesus. I didn't ask them too many questions about who they were living with. And I would never say to anybody ever, like I have heard Ted Wilson say, well, if you don't believe with everything here, just leave. Because for me, my connection to this church is deeper than the doctrines, is different than the doctrines. It is, my connection is a cultural, it's a family connection. And I will admit that I sometimes think of my church as a bit of a dysfunctional family, but it is still a family that I don't know that I can ever leave. And so I treat all of those people who are somehow gathered into this group as part of the family. And I did that as pastor too. If somebody showed up, they were part of the family. I don't care if they were gay. I don't care if they were heroin addicts, whatever they wanted to be, they were part of the family. So I don't know, I'm feeling, Reinder, that if you were my conference president, I might have been one of the guys that you took aside and said, you know, Lauren, I'm not sure you really belong here.
Actually, you know, some people have sometimes questioned my judgment when I was in a leadership position, but I don't recollect that any of the pastors have been particularly worried about the fact that I was a kind of policeman in any kind of way. I think that they usually agreed that they received a fair amount of freedom.
Good.
And trust, you know, because basically also it's a trust. You know Lawrence Turner, don't you?
I do very well, yes.
I remember a very, very good sermon that he preached on the kingdom of God being like this net. It draws in all kinds of fish. And so, you know, and it's not our task to sort out the fish, because that is what the angels do at the end of time.
Same with the wheat and the weeds, by the way.
That's right. And so
I know, I don't know. I gotta have more time.
Okay, let's see. Somebody is unmuted here. Ray, do you want to join in here?
Yes, I had a question. When we refer to our church, I'm interested in what we mean by our church. When we use the phrase love your church, love our church, or we see it in periodicals or whatever, our church, are we speaking the SDA church, the .org, or Christ Church? I think, to me, we often use that word and you get the assumption we're talking about the SDA church. I may be heretical on that, but I don't consider loving our church as being the SDA church, but as I would say Christ Church. I see a distinction between Christ Church, .org, or SDA Church. Now,
yes,
is that erroneous thinking or what?
I think that is not erroneous thinking, that is biblical thinking. There is Christ Church, the universal church, and he only knows who are part of that. And that is a church also that has belonged to the various ages and the present and the future, Christ Church. But, you know, I want to be a Christian, and that's true for most of us. But we can only be a Christian in a particular kind of package. And I think some of the packages are better than other packages. And I happen to be a Christian within an Adventist package. And My parents were Seventh-day Adventists. That is one of the key reasons. But I have remained in this church, in this particular community, and I have enough reasons, I feel, to stay there. And by and large, I feel, not always, but at times I feel happy there. I also feel that I can now be of service to at least some in that community. And then when we talk about the Seventh-day Adventist Church as that package, then I think it's also within our background, and somebody mentioned that already, that whereas we tend to, or in our community, tend to emphasize the global aspect of our church, whereas the New Testament would emphasize the local aspect of that church. Paul wrote to the Church of Jesus Christ in Rome, the Church of Jesus Christ in Corinth. And that is where the church is. It is in Washington, it is in Amsterdam, it is, and yes, there's also a group of people in Silver Spring. But to say that the church is the global Seventh-day Adventist Church and all the glorious aspects of it, no, I wouldn't emphasize that aspect. And I think there is a trend, at least in the Western world, to more and more emphasize the local aspect of the church, and that is healthy, I think.
A very good point, and I'm going to turn now to Dr. Ness or Judy, Dr. Ness, which I don't know which one is going to be asking the question. Which of the Dr. Nesses?
Well, I'm not quite a doctor. I'm a master, I guess, by degree. Somehow that doesn't sound quite right.
We'll count you as an authority nonetheless. Go ahead.
Well, I am a social worker, so I am completely unable to resist getting involved in this. Social workers are steeped in systems theory, families, bureaucracies, social structures, politics. So we tend to think of systems and how people impact systems and how they're impacted by a system. And it's interesting because, you know, as you first started talking today, I really quickly got into my Oxford dictionary here and I looked up argumentative, which those of you who know me will know will not be surprised that I have been told I can be argumentative, although over the years I've learned to do that in a more respectful and compassionate way, I hope. But I looked it up and in the Oxford Dictionary defines argumentative, two definitions: given to expressing divergent or opposite views, such as an argumentative child. And believe me, Brian and I had a couple of those. And two, using or characterized by systematic reasoning. And the example it gives is the highest standards of argumentative rigor. And so I actually grew up in a family in which arguing was considered a sign of engagement and intelligence and caring. People who wouldn't argue were considered to be, they didn't care about the family or the topic or the issues. People were expected to give ideas and defend them and think about them and discuss them and accept those and bring those in. It was part of our family culture. Brian and I also, surprise, encouraged our children to ask questions, to express doubts, and we would talk about things. But when they did that in their Adventist church school classes, they got into trouble. And we got into trouble because we were called in and told, we don't want your kids questioning the teacher in front of the class. We don't want those kinds of questions here. And I will, say one of our children has not learned to do it as respectfully and compassionately as the other one, but it's another story. But at some point, a teacher said, that is not the story we want to tell in this class or this school. We don't want to have those doubts expressed here. That's not our mission. And so I'm seeing very much, and it's partly internet, it's partly the politics and the culture right now, this whole thing of being on brand. You have to market your brand or your identity or your mission for your church or your school or your family. And then you have to do this values signaling, where the words you use and the things you say or don't say signal to other members of your system or your tribe or your church, I am really serious about this. I belong to this. I am on brand. And people get very upset if people express ideas that are not on brand and they're not part of the marketing. And one way we see this coming back to us, Brian and I work with college students, is more and more college students are saying if they ask their parents a question or express a doubt, what do they get? They get fear, anxiety, and anger, not parents who were able to sit and discuss those doubts with them, but they freak out because it scares them to hear something that's not on brand because they fear they're expressing a different value. And it's very hard to deal with at the college level because we want people to discuss and to understand themselves and their church and their history better. But it's getting harder to do this. And we have entire states now that are trying to say, oh, we're not going to discuss your history or learn your history or have any doubts because that's too upsetting. We don't want that to happen. And so it's just really interesting to me because arguing is not necessarily a sign of lack of faith or lack of belonging. It actually can be a sign of engagement and interest in what's going on.
Well, I think that's very true. And I think that is something that among the many things that I said, I also mentioned, and that even conflict is not necessarily, strong argumentation is not necessarily a danger. And one point I think that you made is very important, and that is that when people express their doubts or have questions, it creates fear and anxiety. And I explain many of the reactions of some of our top leaders as actually fear. If they allow this to happen, what will be next? So they better have to stop this. And if people question this doctrine, then what doctrine will they question next?
That's right.
And of course, that kind of thinking is not a sign of leadership, but it's a sign of weakness.
Oh, that's a good analysis. I think you're absolutely right. And it's still interesting to me, Reinder, how what authority in a church that was supposed to be somewhat individualistic. It was set up so that membership was based on the congregation, not on the larger church. It still interests me how much authority people have from the Silver Spring when they stand up and speak ex cathedra. A great deal, actually. Tanisha, Pastor
Yes.
Tanisha Kerr, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay. Master Ness, thank you so much for that question, because your question led into mine, which is quite fortuitous. So I raised my hand just as you were getting into your final slide, Reiner, because whenever I hear these presentations, I always go back to the how do we do that? And I love the thoughts that you captured in your final slide. But I was triggered, as very, very triggered by your presentation. It's not what I expected it to be, and I'm a little surprised by my own reaction. I actually had to reach for one of my anxiety tools. I'm coloring, like frantically shading right now, to try to calm myself down, because I realize that I have a lot of trauma from my time pastoring. And one of the things that stands out for me was being in my local church when the last vote regarding women's ordination was taken. And we had invested years, all this time and all this money and all this effort to study a doctrine of ordination, to then put to vote not what we had found as a result of the study, but something else, whether or not we should have an all or nothing. Like, are we all going to do it at once, or are we not? Even though, people had said, divisions had voted, even if our territory isn't ready, if it won't hinder the gospel in other regions, then let it go forward. But that's not what we put to vote. And I remember thinking how deceptive that was, because we did not honestly share with the congregation at large what had been found from the study. And we didn't put to vote what we had found from the study. And after the vote was taken, I remember it was a Wednesday afternoon, and I remember because I sat in my office and I cried. And then when I was done, I had to get up and go deliver Wednesday night prayer service for my church, after my ministry had been invalidated by my church because of what I view as political wording. And so you started off by talking about authority coming from a place of love and being tempered by love. And I personally feel like, as a minister, I was in an abusive relationship with my church. And as a fourth generation Adventist, that's a very difficult place for me to be in. And it's taken me a long time to get to where I am, and I'm still not past it. Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of the polarization in the church. I see the people who, well-meaning, who love God, who love the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who want to encourage dialogue on a range of issues. And I see those voices crying out with other opinions, the responsible dissent that you've discussed, but it is being regarded as heresy, and you're trying to destroy the church, and you're bringing in all of these worldly doctrines into the church, and nobody's listening. And so it brought me back, coming towards the end of your presentation. My thought was, the kind of discourse that your presentation talks about is only possible in an environment of confidence, if the leadership is confident that this is the church of God, that God takes care of his church and God will guide his church, regardless of all the opinions and the messiness that will come about, regardless of what the members do and how our brokenness rubs against each other, that this is God's church and God will take care of his church and guide his church. There's a confidence that has to come from the leadership that has to also flow through the membership, that we can disagree, but we have that shared past and we're moving towards a common future. So we can confidently disagree and grow together. It's like the clinker bricks, the bricks that are malformed and they rub against each other, but in rubbing against each other, they find a way to perfectly fit together. That's a lot of confidence. And I don't see that confidence amongst our membership, and I don't see it coming from our leadership. So in the context of responsible dissent, do you have any suggestions for how we go about raising that level of confidence within the ranks, within our leadership? Is that something that we just leave up to prayer? Is that something we can actively work towards? I don't know if you have an answer for how we move to that place where we can openly and comfortably have these discussions without the fear and the anxiety that it's going to destroy us. We're all gonna burn unless we all agree. How do we create that environment? How do we even begin?
Well, thank you for your reaction. And I remember that fateful Wednesday afternoon. And it was one of the occasions in the history of Adventism where politics won over pastoral and theological concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a recipe for how we can bring about change as far as that is concerned. I realize that some things take a lot of time. It always has been that in the history of the church. Usually developments have not taken place in periods of years, but rather of decades or even longer. We have seen a pendulum swinging back and forth in our church. And at the moment the pendulum is at one side, we must fear that it's not swinging back yet. And we must fear that the Wilson period may be extended by having the current secretary of the General Conference take Wilson's place. And it has become a rather frequent trick, and I call it a trick, to avoid elections at the General Conference by stepping away a couple of months before the General Conference and then making the change. And I hope that the church will remain alert and try to avoid that is going to happen. One of the things that I'm convinced of is that those of us who see ourselves as, well, what is the word, progressives, or what? Anyway, those of us who are eager to see changes in the church, like the ones that we have been discussing, that we do not give up and that we remain visible and continue to stick out our neck. One of the great dangers, I think, is that many of those who have similar thoughts that, as I have been expressing, as you have been expressing, and many in this group, many have given up and walk away and say, I cannot be part of this community longer. But I try to do the little I can to say to people, hang in there, stay, and keep speaking up whenever the opportunity is given to you. And I find it encouraging to realize that many have similar thoughts. But yes, they are afraid to talk. They are afraid to stick their neck out. And I can understand that, especially when you're on the payroll of the church, that sometimes can be an issue. But let's hang in there. Those of us who call ourselves progressives, or whatever label you want to, this is the community where we can still have an influence. And even if it takes time, but yeah, you know, when you have been affected by some of this in a very direct way, like you as a female pastor, then I think it is more difficult than for me as a retired male pastor.
You make a good point here. This last thing I had jotted down while you were talking, the sudden courage that a lot of us get when we retire, right? You've had friends who suddenly spoke up, but the opposite of that is, Reinder, I've written to people who have recently retired, and I said, could you please now speak up? Nobody's going to fire you. And it's surprising how many of our older colleagues still can't get past that barrier. They'll tell me personally, they'll say, you know, I know what you're saying is true, but I just can't get myself to say it out loud. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, but on the other hand, I know I'm retired, so I'm more free to speak.
Right.
But this is the type of thing that I've always felt free to speak and to write. And of course, you know, sometimes there were occasions when you had to tone down a bit, because you don't have to be stupid, you know, even if
exactly.
But I found that it is actually possible to operate in the church at a certain level and still speak your mind.
Yeah, I started writing for Spectrum, and some fairly challenging pieces, I think mid-2000, the mid-aughts. And I remember getting letters from people. You'll find this interesting. People high up in the church leaders, writing and saying, "Thank you so much for saying that. I don't know how you get away with it." And I said, "Well, thank goodness I have a really good conference president. Raj Adikan was my president at that time, and anything that came his way, he just knocked it back and said, you know, this is not a problem. Lauren's a great pastor. I love what he writes. It's not a problem." So it went on. Hey, Mike, I got to tell you about Mike. Mike has a wife who is an extraordinary preacher. I don't know if you guys know this about him. She's taking a little break right now. But yeah, she's really good. She's got some pieces up online, I think, Mike. And I saw them and I said, wow, this person, this woman is really a good presenter. We have to make her famous, Mike. She's really good. I know you're proud of her too, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, for sure. Reinder, thank you so much for your presentation. And you know, when I was listening to you, I just, yeah, kind of realized how complicated the whole topic is. And there is no right solving answer for this conundrum. Because, you know, I agree with you that on the one hand, we do. Well, I have actually 2 points that I want to say. On the one hand, I agree that we have this need for, as a group, for authority to say something, to you know, to say not everything goes in a way, you know. But yeah, it's not that easy. I was stuck a little bit on that essential Adventist beliefs, and I wanted to go back a little bit to that, if you don't mind. I mean, that was the ultimate goal of the fundamental beliefs, right? To have some kind of core saying of what Adventist is really standing for. I mean, if I remember my history classes from the seminary, James was against writing something like this, James White, but he got so much pressure, and then finally he wrote a couple of points down to kind of say what the core of Adventism is. I guess he also saw the need to define some kind of core to be able to refute some non-Adventist thinking, whatever that now means. And this core Adventist is changing because now of a global church. So for the Germans, some things might not be the core, but for the Brazilians, it might be the core. And now we are ending up with 28. And I heard that even 2 more are in the pipeline to be voted on at some point. So yeah, how do we deal with this conundrum? And the second point, I see authority kind of as a double-edged sword. As a pastor, I have caught myself sometimes arguing with the church manual, with church authority, when I try to argue against certain streams that I consider dangerous, like, for example, headship theology or certain topics from Walter Veit, that, you know, with good intentions from my side, obviously, I was thinking, okay, here, I need to argue with the church manual. I'm the pastor. No, I can decide who's preaching in this church, and I'm not letting that person preach because I know this will be nonsense, or, you know, what I consider nonsense. But in the end, you know, where's the difference? What I mean from my, progressive liberal position, I consider, for example, headship theology dangerous, and I would say I could argue biblically. But so does the more conservative person or traditional person argue against women ordination or even homosexuality. And they also argue biblically. Who is right? My interpretation or their interpretation? It's complicated. And I guess I can find comfort that I am, or I was, in a community where the majority supported my understanding. For example, on women ordination, and my old conference where I was working in, at the end we voted to ordain women, which I was very happy about. But I wonder, how is it possible to actually get along, regardless of our theological interpretation? And what I mean is, what would practically need to happen in the liberal or in the conservative thinking, or in their heart, to get along regardless of theological conviction?
Well, you mentioned 2 things, and first of all, about the fundamental beliefs. And yes, when James White put out his first list, I think it was in 1872, it was actually kind of a public relations exercise. It is, people ask, what do Seventh-day Adventists believe? So we need to tell them what are the key points of our beliefs. But we have moved from telling others descriptive to proscriptive. This is what you must believe in order to be a true Seventh-day Adventist. And I would say again, when people do not know our history, if they knew our history a little better, then maybe they would say, we may have to bend our way a little bit because we are doing some things that are actually contrary to our roots, where we came from. When it comes to these people that, you know, they want your pulpit, and they have a message. And in particular, I'm allergic to the name of Walter Veit.
Yeah, same.
I just cannot understand why the church tolerates this. We have a biblical research institute, and they fulminate against all kinds of wrong ideas. Well, they don't have to go very far when they look at Walter Veit to find stupid ideas. And I think that he should be unmasked much more clearly than we are doing. We are allowing that. But
how do you explain that, Reinder? How do you explain that some of these people with really far out ideas get a pass for so long, and yet they will stand up and fulminate against gay people or women in ministry so much? How do you explain that? What's going on? I don't know these men really closely, but it astonishes me what they choose to focus on.
yeah, well, many of their ideas are actually closer to the opinions of some of our top leaders than they could be of your and mine opinion. So they are seen as orthodox. They may have some weird ideas, but they're seen as orthodox. And there are, I believe, also donors in our church, powerful donors who support some of these ministries. And that is very unfortunate. But I've had the misfortune of being the speaker at a conference where Walter Veit was one of the speakers. A very unlikely combination. And well, he is apparently convinced that I'm on the payroll of the Jesuits, and of course, you are as well. So
I am too. Yeah, we'll talk about that at our next Jesuits meeting, you and me.
At least you are the pastor, and you can give some counter. You have a counter influence, your own sermons, and maybe in people you can also invite to come to your church.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor up here. Hey, Bob Martin, I'm going to let the lady go first. Is that okay? I'm going to let podcaster Pastor Danielle Simmons jump in here because she's been so nice to me this week. She invited me to help her on her podcast, and we had so much fun, Danielle. That was a great conversation, and people really engaged with it. Somebody wrote me,
Yes.
"Isn't kicking a dead horse?" I said, both Danielle and I said we kind of thought so, but we were astonished how many people wanted to engage on the topic. People have been, Danielle, it seems to me people have been deeply hurt by little things. And sometimes we still have to talk about those little things like jewelry. And that's what we did. So keep an eye open for Danielle's next podcast, going to be on Thursday night. But Danielle, I brought you on to ask your question or make your comment to Dr. Bruinsma.
Yes, thank you. I love what you shared from Julia. It says that he defined unity as a group bound together.
I cannot.
Yeah, Danielle, you're cutting out for some reason. We can't hear your voice. We're just getting a syllable here or there. Is there anything you can do differently? Why don't I go to Bob Martin and then I'll come back to you, and maybe by that time you're not getting a good signal, my friend. Hey, Bob, how are things going? I asked you in the chat. It looks like your boss is getting a lot of pressure there in New York City. Is he okay?
Yes, it's the certain folks wanted New York City to feel the pain of the unaddressed immigrant crisis, and they have succeeded. They have
Mhm.
succeeded in sharing the pain, certainly.
And sometimes sharing it with those of you who work for the city. Reinder, Bob works for the mayor of New York City, so I just wanted you to know that.
Okay. Yeah. So, Dr. Bruinsma, I enjoyed your noteworthy presentation, and I have two questions. They are related. I want to ask you the issue of the threshold. So, in your presentation, you noted that you talked about responsible dissent. Talk about responsible dissent. Then, of course, the topic talking about authority. And we know the authority of the church, and the church uses that authority to discipline its members, both ministers and lay members. Now, my question is this: what is your threshold, or what's your definition for responsible dissent? And do you think responsible dissent can be transformative, or is it just tinkering around the edges? And in the same vein, I have seen, again, from a child, the church imposing discipline on members. And of course, the discipline is going to be relative to geography, to where the church is. What do you regard as the threshold for disciplining members, whether ministers or lay members of the church? And how do we avoid relativism in the exercise of discipline and what you describe as responsible dissent? Those are my questions. Thank you.
These are difficult questions to answer. And I was afraid that somebody might ask those questions because I don't have a real definition of what is responsible. Other than that, the person who utters dissent must always ask himself, herself, is what I'm doing going to help? Do I do it in the most responsible, reasonable way at the right moment? In other words, it depends a lot of where you are, what your role is, the circumstances where you operate. So I don't think there is going to be one particular definition and saying, well, this is responsible and this is not. I've been in different leadership roles and have always tried to voice my opinions in such a way that it would sound as a reasonable invitation to further dialogue. And I hope that I would always phrase things in such a way that they would not necessarily that bring up anger or yeah. So it's difficult to say, but we all know, I think, people who dissent in a very disagreeable way. And we've heard the word before, very argumentative way. And sometimes also in a very unchristian way. So it's very difficult to really define what a threshold is. And it is just as difficult to define where the threshold is of discipline, in particular in our postmodern Western society, where discipline is a problem anyway. Discipline is supposed to be a means of helping people to come to a better spiritual understanding of some things and to, if necessary, change a certain behavior. And in some cultures and in some geographical areas of the world, that still works quite well. And you have certain criteria in the church manual that can help you. But in many other places, it is, you will just chase people away if you handle in the way the church manual prescribes. So there also, it has become much more difficult to, in a responsible way, again the word, bring people to the understanding that particular forms of thinking and behavior are not acceptable. And there are some clear examples where you would have to say, well, there is a consensus among the members that this cannot be tolerated, and we have to say either you change or you have to leave. But those are not, it is often not that clear cut and that easy. And sometimes you have to let time do its work. It's not a very satisfying answer, I know, but I don't have any better answer than that.
I thought it was a pretty good answer. Thank you very much. And Bob, thank you for being on. Danielle, let's try you again, see if we can hear you.
Okay, is it any better now?
Yes, it is better actually. Probably because you turned off your video, you got a little wider bandwidth.
Thank you, Doug and Teresa, for that suggestion.
We can't see your lovely face, but we can hear your voice this time.
Wonderful. My question was coming from the quote that was shared, the Josiah Royce quote, that said, defines community as a group of people who are bound together by the memory of a shared past to the future. And I am wondering, in a global organization as diverse as the Adventist Church, with so many different cultures and languages and generations, what would you say is our shared past, and what would be the common hope of the future? Because all Christians share hope of the coming of Christ. What would be the shared common hope, your past, and your common hope for Adventist, the global church, that will unite as a group? Because currently we don't seem to know what it is, since we're not united.
Well, I think I have understood the essence of your question, even though the sound is not perfect yet. But yes, our past is to some extent very different, and that is, and maybe if I should repeat this presentation somewhere else, I should add that the shared past is important. It's also important to realize that the past for not all entities in the is the same. And that is an important correction. And thank you for bringing that to our attention. We must know where we come from. We must be quite honest about that. You know, where does Adventism come from? We need to know some of the history, some of the good things and some of the bad things. You know, it helps tremendously know something about, for instance, the history of Ellen White, if you want to know what her role can be today. So there is a shared history that we must know. But yes, we must be aware of the fact that Adventism has developed and grown in a different way in the Netherlands from, let's say, Ghana or the Philippines. So that is, I think, an important point. The common goals. We have a challenge there to define that more properly, I think. One of the goals at the moment seems to be that we want to distribute 1 billion copies of The Great Controversy. That is, of course, a common objective, a common goal, if we believe the GC. But that is hardly going to keep us together as a church. It must be telling the story of Jesus Christ in a way that, and with some of the emphases that are part of our history, of our tradition, part of the tradition that we value, and to make that relevant for living in the 21st century. That is the common goal. And so unless we share that, we will be more and more polarized as we all emphasize different aspects. Well,
I'm going to ask, we're right at the end here. I'm going to ask our elder Herr Doctor, Dr. Johnston, to have the last word, if that's okay. Bob, you want to do that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Just 2 points. Congregationalism is not necessarily the solution. If you want to see kingly power, look at the pastors of some of the independent megachurches. You're all familiar with the saying, power corrupts and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. You may want to recall where that saying originated. Lord Acton said that in the wake of the 1870 Vatican Council, which declared the dogma of papal infallibility. My second point is go back to Ignatius of Antioch, and this is something I'd like to get Reinder's response to. Ignatius was obsessively concerned with unity. The church was threatened, in his view, by Judaizers and Docetists, Gnostics, maybe even David Koresh type people. And he felt that the solution was a tight hierarchical church organization, the monarchical episcopacy and a 3-rank ministry of bishop, elder, and deacon. So the concern was unity, and he felt that tight organization, hierarchical organization, was the only way to maintain it. Can we make too much of a fetish about unity? Those are my 2 observations.
Okay. I think the first point is very well taken, that congregationalism is not necessarily, and these mega churches and the examples that we could quote are many. And also, you can have kingly power also in a 30-member little church where one elder is the absolute despot, and nothing happens unless he agrees. So this is a temptation for a church, I think, any size. And human nature being what it is, there are always going to be people who have large egos. Unfortunately, some people they look very humble and they speak about humility all the time, but they are just as despotic as people who are more vocal about it. But yeah, a pleasant local church where there is a real sense of community.
Yes.
That is the ideal, but unfortunately, in many places, that is far from reality. Unity, can we make a fetish of that? Yes, I think so. And we ought to be realistic. And what type of unity do we want? Do we want to have a unity where we all believe the same? That is impossible. We are not all theologians, and we are at different stages in our spiritual development, and we have different philosophical presuppositions with which we approach our theology that differs from place to place. There can only be a consensus about, well, once again, whatever the term means, of some of the essential aspects of Christianity, and in the Adventist version of that. And we can be united as we try in our different ways to understand what the gospel is, and in our different ways try to practice what the gospel teaches us. And it will always be a human effort, and to enforce the kind of unity that I'm afraid some of our leaders are trying to enforce will be a very superficial unity, and it will only cause many of the dissenting voices to go underground. And that means that you will have a superficial unity on the surface, but no real unity anyway. Unity is not to be expressed in submission and in terms of uniformity. Bob,
Hey, I'm keeping an eye on the time here, Doctor. And Emmanuel, I want to apologize to you. I think our time is up, and we'll
It's okay. I understand. It's okay.
Yeah, I didn't mean to be rude or unkind. The time is just gone. I wanted to let you know that Brian Ness is going to be here on the 16th, talking about the original life. Raj Adikan is going to be here on the 23rd, talking about, let's see, Raj Adikan is be talking, can we actually win the world to Christ? And he's done a lot of work on the various ways that people have interpreted what it means to win the world to Christ, in order to say that why somehow we're in charge of getting Jesus to return. Cart Lasik is going to be here at, this is a young woman from Newbold. Pilira Zapita, another doctoral student who is teaching. You guys have to understand, I love having our old professors here, but Reinder, you understand too. We got to bring some of these younger people in, or we're not giving them a voice. And so I've got Pilira Zapita here talking about the Holy Spirit on the 14th of October. And I have Steve Case, who's going to be talking to us in December. And I'm still filling in some of the other spaces. But I've been very careful, Reinder, to make sure that I intersperse our venerable professors with some of the younger people. You understand my concern there.
I feel not being threatened at all.
Good. And so still looking for somebody for the 9th of September. We had a dropout there, and I'll need to find somebody, but that's next week. But I always love having some of these folks come on who I love when we have new people teaching. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for participating. Reinder, thank you for joining us today. Excellent presentation and really good conversation. You have stirred up my mind, made me feel a little rebellious at times, Reinder. And thank you all for everything that you do. And we'll be seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.